Hello and welcome to the Regional Studies Association Professional Development webinar. I'm Madeleine Hatfield. I'm the director of Yellowback, which provides editorial and peer review management services to authors, publishers and learned societies. I'm very pleased to welcome you today to this webinar. The Regional Studies Association is the global and interdisciplinary network for regions, cities, research, development and policy. As a response to the current global crisis, the RSA board agreed initiatives to support its members and the wider community. This is in the form of 2 webinar series and a new grant scheme and free online resources. The RSA Professional Development webinar series, which is this one, runs 3 times a month and covers sessions on publishing, networking, career development and more. There is also the Regional Studies Association Regions, Cities, Industry webinar series, which delivers monthly sessions by experts in the field of regional studies, science, planning and policy. The RSA is also pleased to launch a new small research grant scheme with funds up to £400 or around €4,500, with funds available for research on how regions, cities and industry are addressing the impact of the current COVID-19 crisis. More details on these new initiatives can be found on the RSA website. So some general housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and be made available afterwards to watch on the RSA Members Lounge. If you have questions, so after the webinar, we're going to have some time to take some questions. If you have questions as we go through, please use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions rather than putting them in the general chat, and we'll get through as many questions as we can after the presentation. So today I'm very pleased to introduce the webinar on how to navigate the publishing process. I'm very pleased to welcome John Harrison from Loughborough University in the UK, who is our presenter today. John is a regional geographer interested in the planning and governance of cities and regions in globalisation. John has been an editor of Regional Studies, one of the RSA journals, since 2013, first as its inaugural early career editor and then section editor for Urban and Regional Horizons. John, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Maddie, and thank you to the Regional Studies Association for organising this webinar series and inviting me to participate today. Connecting with others is always important, but in this time, I hope that whatever your situation is, the opportunity to spend 30 minutes talking about research and remembering why it is we're all passionate about research will prove to be a nice break from everything that's going on. Today, I've been asked to speak about navigating the publishing process and in particular, what to expect. In putting this together, what I've tried to do is to offer some generic advice, but really try to bring together my own personal experience, both as a journal author, but also as a reviewer and as a journal editor. Now, in last week's webinar series, the inaugural seminar was delivered by Maddie, and Maddie provided an excellent overview of how to identify the right journal for your research. And what I want to do today is to build on that a little bit and try to think about the importance of how, as a researcher, we can look to align our own research interests and the research paper we want to write and make sure that we target the appropriate journal. To demonstrate this, I'm going to use the 5 journals that the Regional Studies Association publish as a way to try and illustrate how I think about and how you might think about targeting your research to the appropriate journal. In my case, I'm a researcher who is obsessed with regions. So every piece of research that I do has a central theme to it, and that theme is regions. So you might expect that I would target all 5 of the RSA journals, but actually, it's not appropriate for me and my own research to think about all 5 journals, and certainly each paper that I might write should be targeted at a specific journal. So let's take the top 3 journals: Regional Studies, Territory Politics Governance and Spatial Economic Analysis. The title gives you some indication that there are differences between these journals, but there is more to it than this. As an author, one of the first things I would do is to think about the methods, but also the content and type of paper that that journal publishes. So regional studies publishes both qualitative and quantitative research, but also it has a very strong focus on both the political processes and economic processes affecting regions and regional development. By contrast, territory politics governance, not exclusively, but predominantly publishes research which is more qualitative and also very much more focused on the politics and political aspects of territorial or regional development. In contrast, spatial economic analysis is not exclusively, but predominantly focused on economics and also quantitative research. So what this means is that a paper that would get published in territory politics governance almost certainly would not get published in spatial economic analysis. Likewise, a paper in spatial economic analysis you would not expect to find in territory politics governance. For me personally, if I submitted a paper to spatial economic analysis as somebody who works on the political side of the discipline and does predominantly qualitative research, I would expect nothing less than a desk reject because my research would not be appropriate for that journal. And picking the journal is really important because one of the things that happens is that as editors, we do desk reject a number of papers because they are out of scope. So this first step is really important. To complete the suite of RSA journals, regional studies, regional science, again, is very similar to regional studies in published in both qualitative and quantitative research and more political and economic, but it has distinctive features. It is the RSA's open access journal. It also has a very strong early career mentoring feature, and also there is a much stronger variety of papers that they will admit. Similarly, area development policy has a very specific focus, which is the greater BRICS economies, or more broadly, emerging economies. So each journal has a distinctive style. For me, the highlighting on the screen, territory politics, governance and regional studies have a green border because they are the two journals that I would look to submit to because of my research and that I have published in. Spatial economic analysis is red because it's a journal that I would not target and I would not find it appropriate for my research. Whereas regional studies, regional science and area development policy are highlighted amber. I would consider publishing those, but it would be a very specific type of paper. For you, it will be different. So hopefully kind of a top tip here that I would have is, this is the initial stage of the process, but I find it very useful to look at the reference list that I have in my paper before I submit, and to check that the type of papers that I'm citing are the type of papers that I would expect to find in the journal that I'm looking to publish in. If you're not citing regional studies or similar journals and you're thinking of submitting to that journal, there's possibly a clue there that it might not be the right journal for your research. Understanding the aims and scope of any journal is important in the next stage of preparing your manuscript. Journal websites are not only outline the aims and scope, but they also provide lots of helpful information to authors preparing their manuscript. And certainly for the RSA journals, the publisher Taylor and Francis provide an enormous amount of resources to help authors in this process of preparing your manuscript. It is vitally important to recognise that every journal has its own style. In this way, it's a bit like music. Okay? All artists try to produce records that maybe are 3 or 4 minutes long. Similarly, all journals publish research papers. But like all artists, they have to have their own distinctive style to be able to stand out in a crowded marketplace. And journals are no different, so they develop their own particular identity. Now, information on a journal website is very interesting and very useful, but I find it quite generic. So my advice would always be to go and actually look at papers in that journal to get a real feel for what the aims and scope of the journal are. So my analogy here would be to think about trying to describe to somebody why Lionel Messi is one of the greatest footballers. Okay? You can have a 100-word description, but I would find watching some highlights, or in this case, looking at some highlights from the journal, leaves a far longer or lasting impression of what I'm trying to achieve than maybe just a generic description. But also I try to learn from these papers, and I think it's something I would really encourage, because these authors or these papers have been successful in what you're trying to achieve. Remember that you can identify common traits or common features that maybe enable them to be successful in publishing in that journal. But you can also learn so much more. Are you seeing papers on your research being published there? Because again, if not, it might suggest that it's not the right journal for you. Are they using the same methods? So if it's predominantly statistics and you're a qualitative researcher, you might find that even though the title of the journal is appropriate, that actually it's not a very good fit. Do they publish the type of article that you want to submit? So if it's all 8,000 word journal articles and you want to write a short commentary, will that journal allow you to do that? And finally, do you think the readers of that journal are going to be interested in your research? Is it a natural home for that research? So what I find really useful here is to, as I write, I always have 2 or 3 what I would call exemplar articles next to me as I write, because this gives me a sense of what I want to try and achieve, what's key to publishing in that journal. But I also find it useful when you come across writer's block to have a couple of articles there just to try and get some inspiration for how you might start to write an abstract or start to write a particular section of a paper. Journal editors. So one of my roles is as a journal editor, and the role of the journal editor is not just to make a decision on a paper. Okay? So yes, journal editors are the bearers of the good news or the bad news, but really what we're trying to do is we're trying to make a decision about a paper, and we're looking for 2 things. The first one is the inherent interest and significance of, or importance of a research paper. So we're looking for its originality and significance, but we're also looking for rigor. Does the research stand up to scrutiny? Does it withstand critique? So when we're looking through a paper, and what we're looking for authors to do when you're submitting a paper is we're looking for papers that have sufficient originality and significance, so it's interesting and important to people, but it's also that the findings are justifiable and will stand up to that scrutiny. So assuming that the science stacks up in your paper, the key question is to ask yourself is the so what question, because this is the one that journal editors are having to focus on. It's not simply enough to say, I set out to research this, this is how I did it, this is what I found. Because every paper that's within scope of the journal would be expected to do that. So set out to try and make it impossible for the journal editor to say no by convincing us of of your paper. Speaking as a reviewer and a journal editor, start with what we know, then try and explain what we should know that we don't currently, and then convince us. So you need to convince us why this is important to the readers of our journal. And this involves engaging with the review process, because one of the key roles of a journal editor is to help authors not only to help get their paper to be accepted, but also to maximise its potential. And this is where rhetoric meets reality. A lot of the perception of the review process is similar to the cartoon on the slide. The reality is that over 2 million journal articles get published every year in scientific outlets. So it can't be that scary. Don't get me wrong, there are the dreaded reviewer twos out there, and occasionally you do see it. But generally speaking, the vast majority of reviewers and editors are trying to offer constructive advice to help you to publish your research and ensure it reaches its audience. So 3 pieces of advice that I would always give is reviewer comments always look better on the second viewing. No matter how you read them in the first instance, if you leave it 2 days and reread them, they always read in a different light. So having that break is really important. Secondly, a good editor will always interpret the reviewer comments for you and give you a strong steer as to what's required. And thirdly, no paper that I've ever published or I've ever seen published has not been anything other than significantly improved by the peer review process. So my top tip is not really a tip. It's really just a reminder to try and balance the rhetoric with the reality of the review process. But if you do want an extra tip, my advice would always be to have a look at the first version of a paper that you've submitted and then the finally accepted one at the end of the peer review process. because you will see a marked difference in the actual final version. If you're a PhD student, do the same with a piece of work that you've submitted to your supervisor. Compare and contrast the first version and then the one that's benefited from that peer review, because I would challenge anybody to not see the benefit of that constructive feedback, no matter how much hard work it might feel when you first see it. So to finish off with some takeaways, I apologise if the mention of takeaways makes you suddenly feel hungry, but I hope I've convinced you of the importance of the first two. The third one, though, is the one that I want to focus on. And in effect, this might be classed as the Big Mac of takeaways. Because yes, this does come with experience. Navigating the publishing process does take experience and you learn as you go. But we all need support. I am still learning and still to this day do many of the things that I've highlighted in this presentation. It is also why I'm so thankful to the RSA for doing this professional development webinar series, especially at this time where we can reach so many more people, at a time when we all need to feel connected and supported. Back in 2002, one of the best decisions I made was to join the RSA because the opportunities for mentoring, professional development, networking with peers are so unmatched in my view. They really do care. I was also exceptionally lucky to have a PhD supervisor in Martin Jones, who guided me with very honest advice on navigating the publishing process. So my advice at the end of all this is do everything you can to surround yourself with good people who are ready and willing to help you. And with that, I'll hand back to Maddie.
Thank you, John, for that really interesting presentation. We now have a little bit of time for questions. If you have a question, just a reminder to please put that in the Q&A box on Zoom so that we can tackle as many of those questions as we can do. To get us started, John, I would like to ask you, is it a good idea to get feedback on a manuscript before you submit it to a journal?
I would say it's desirable. I wouldn't say it's absolutely essential because ultimately, when you submit the paper, there's no rule, there's no obligation that somebody must have read the paper beforehand. But I think it goes back to that final point, which is how important mentoring is. I would certainly not submit a paper without first having perhaps gone to a conference and presented the paper and got feedback that way. I wouldn't necessarily send a paper to lots of people to read a first version, partly because everybody's very, very busy. But I would usually send it to at least one or two people, or even just ask a colleague in the corridor in my department to read it as a complete outsider, just to see if the core message, the core kind of originality and significance of the paper, that they can see it. Because if they can't, if I was to submit it to the journal, obviously there's a time aspect in terms of the peer review process, and I would rather make that correction before I submit than doing it through the peer review process.
Great, thank you very much, John. And one further question. What is your advice when two referees, or even more perhaps, might give you kind of polar opposite feedback on your manuscript, and the editor has not taken that extra step, has not been able to give you the advice on how to navigate those? What would be your advice?
So I probably have to be slightly careful here as an editor, because one thing, my first piece of advice would actually be, if you do get contradictory reviews, and it is actually quite common. So sometimes if you were to get 3 reviews, sometimes you'd have a reviewer who's very much in favour of the paper, one who's more critical, and sometimes there's somebody who sits in the middle. If you find that you have reviews that are so extreme in terms of their opposition, or they're totally contradictory in the direction of the paper, the 2 things I would consider. The first one, which is the one with the editor, is there's no reason why you can't write a short email to the editor and just say, I found that the reviews are contradictory. This is how I'm planning to go about the revision. I just want to check before I do that you feel that's appropriate, because you've always going to favour one reviewer over the other if you do that. The second one is that I would say probably 97, 98% of cases, even where reviews might look contradictory, when you look at them, you might find a way to balance both of them, or you might find a way to at least acknowledge to one reviewer that you agree that they have a valid point, but that you can't do both within the paper, and that you've chosen one approach because you think that's the right one for the paper. And sometimes what one of the reviewers is asking is actually another paper that you might want to write. So I think it's just being open and honest and having dialogue, both with the reviewers through the letter that you send back. Also, you can contact the editor, but I would say only if it looks as if it is unmanageable to kind of do the reviews and the revisions that have been asked for.
Thank you, John. And we've got loads of questions flooding in now, which I think shows how important this topic is and how many important issues that you have touched upon. Another question sort of related to that, managing feedback on reviews, is in cases where the editor might be seen to be guiding the paper in a different direction from the reviewers. And I wonder if you can talk about sort of why that might happen and how as an author you might deal with that situation.
Yes, this is something that as an editor personally I do. I will always, when I send a decision letter out, I always try to interpret the reviewer's comments, because sometimes some of the suggestions are perhaps not necessarily appropriate for the journal. So sometimes a reviewer might write something with the best intentions, but actually it's not something that the journal allows for. So I think it's important to tell the author that. Sometimes what I find is also that as an editor, reviewers have two options when they provide comments. So one is the publicly available version that they have, which are called the comments to author. But quite often reviewers will write a short few sentences to the editor, which might highlight that some of their revisions they're suggesting they see as essential, while some might just be seen as desirable. So the editor might, in the decision letter, focusing on what they see as the essential things for the paper to be accepted, and leave some of the other comments as ones that are more maybe desirable, but that are not going to be essential to whether the paper eventually gets accepted or rejected.
Thank you. Yes, I think that explains there are some good reasons, and I think asking for clarification is also a route open to you if there seems to be a lot of confusion there. Another question that's come forward is you mentioned the importance of mentoring, but a few people have asked how you would identify a good mentor, or how you might get access to a good mentor.
Okay, so there's different ways of doing this. One of those is maybe if you were at the start of your PhD, is just to think about your PhD supervisor. Do they have a track record of publishing with their PhD students? That might give you a steer that they are supportive in that way and might help you to do that. You can also talk to, if you were, say, a first year PhD student, I would encourage you talking to maybe a third year or fourth year PhD student with the same supervisor to see what their experience was as to whether how supportive they were. But in terms of mentoring, what I would always do is try to take up opportunities to go to conferences. Something like the Regional Studies Association run a lot of these type of sessions at conferences where you can talk to people. But in terms of mentoring, I think you get a very good steer from looking at the member of staff that you might be thinking of doing a PhD with or working with. And I think just surround yourself with good collaborators. So co-authors are absolutely essential, and I focused on my PhD supervisor, but all the way through my career, I've benefited enormously in terms of how to navigate the publication process by identifying co-authors who I find a positive experience to work with. So yes, identifying them is a challenge at times, but I think you will get a very quick understanding of those people who have the time and are willing to do it because they have a track record of doing that.
That's very helpful, thank you. And you've also touched upon the question of co-authorship. And again, that's another source of a number of questions, as it was last week. And I wonder if you have any advice to authors on managing the co-authoring process?
So yes, if you, at my institution, for example, we have an authorship policy which is designed to particularly help early career authors, maybe postdocs, people working as research assistants, but also PhD students, because there is this big challenge at times about ownership of academic work. Again, it partly to do with mentoring. A really good PhD supervisor or mentor will support you, but they will not expect you to do all the work and for their name to be on the paper, having done little input. So I would always say that the authorship, the line with authorship is that somebody who's made a positive contribution to the piece of work that's been submitted. With my own PhD students, if what I had contributed to the paper is just advice and guidance, I would never expect or even approach the PhD student or early career person to have my name on that paper. I would only co-author with my PhD students or an early career researcher if I had actually contributed to the paper by doing the research or actually writing large parts of the paper. And certainly if I was to use that personal experience, Martin, my PhD supervisor, the amount of input in the first few papers that I published is enormous. Martin encouraged me to submit the paper because I wrote all the words, but there's an enormous amount of input in there. So again, it comes down to identifying people who are ready and willing and able to support you. But good institutions will have an authorship policy to help in that regard. But again, experience and people's track record is something to look at.
Thank you very much. Another question coming through is, you mentioned the use of exemplar articles that you might use as a kind of model, I suppose, when writing your own papers. So these would be articles that you'd chosen perhaps from the target journal you were looking at. How would you go about choosing those? What would you look for?
So I look for two things. Firstly, I look for papers that are maybe adopting a similar approach. So the closest ones in terms of fit to both the research topic I'm interested in, but also maybe using the same methods. So if I was to go to regional studies, at the moment I'm writing about regional planning. So I would go and look in the last 2 or 3 years for some papers in the journal that are on that topic using similar methods. The second thing I would do is to look at papers and just get a feel for papers that when I look at them, when I read the abstract, I'm immediately hooked and thinking I want to read on. So those papers that maybe are being highly cited and getting picked up and generating interest, because again, there's an important aspect to this, which is you don't just want to publish your research. That's the first hurdle to get over, is to get the work published. The second one is to make your research attractive to readers and obviously other researchers who then go on and engage with it and to kind of generate that debate. So I go for papers that I enjoy reading and also the ones that are closest to the work that I'm trying to write about.
Thank you. And another question that's come in is, how important is it to be seen to be referencing articles that have been published in the journal that you are submitting your paper to? So citations to articles within the journal.
There is a balance. I would not encourage you just to cite papers from that journal for the sake of it. That you should write the paper and engage with the literature that's most important to deliver the best paper that you can. But it would be very strange, I think, to submit a paper to a journal where you're not trying to connect to debates taking place in that journal. So one of the purposes of a journal is to generate and to stimulate debates relevant to the title. So in regional studies, in recent years, we've had major debates about innovation, about, and hopefully in the future ones about planning. So there are certain debates that journals have reputations for. And so if you're positioning your research to be part of that debate, then you need to situate it within what the current state of the art is for that field. So I would expect if you were submitting a journal article for regional studies to see at least 1 or 2 references to papers in that journal, but it doesn't have to be. You don't have to have cited a paper from regional studies, but I would expect to see some references to related journals to regional studies. If your whole reference list is to literature in the Journal of Business Management, in entrepreneurship, and nothing that has an explicitly spatial component, again, that would maybe present an issue because of the alignment to the aims and scope of the journal. So yes, 1 or 2 references as a minimum, but don't think that if you cite 30 regional studies articles in your paper, that automatically gets you accepted. It's the quality of the paper that is the be-all and end-all.
Thank you very much, John. I'm aware that we've come up to the official end of our half-hour webinar, but we've still got a great number of questions. So John and I are happy to stay on the line for a little bit longer and try to take a few more of those questions. Also, apologies for anyone who's having a little bit of difficulty. There was a little bit of breakup in John's sound there, but hopefully you've been able to get the key take-home messages from those answers. We've had another question, which is about the review process. And I think one of the things that perhaps surprises people when they first start on this journey is how long it can take to get a paper peer reviewed. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what sort of is going on behind the scenes and why it may take quite a long time sometimes to get referee reports.
Okay, yes, so this is one of the challenges. There is no finite time on how long a journal will take to review a paper, because there are a number of determining factors. But maybe if I can give a little bit of an indication of what takes the time and what's going on. So initially, when you submit a paper, it doesn't automatically go out to review. The managing team do some preliminary checks to make sure that the paper is within the aims and scope of the journal, but also conforms to the instructions as to what a manuscript must be. That will obviously take a few days as a minimum. Papers that get through that process will then automatically be allocated to an editor, and that editor will make an initial decision on the paper as to whether it goes out to review or whether we make a yes, we get decision. That obviously involves the editor reading the whole paper and reaching that first decision. Assuming that a paper then goes out to review, we're probably looking at 2 weeks before we start that process of inviting reviewers. That task, obviously, for an editor involves identifying suitable reviewers, approaching them, obviously the time it takes them to accept or reject that invitation. And normally journals maybe offer a 1-month window for reviewers to conduct that review. When those reviews come back in, the overseeing editor will look at the reviews again, get a sense for what the reviews information that's giving the editor to inform their decision and proceeding to make that decision. I would say that, as a general rule of thumb, you're probably looking at 3 months as an average to reach that first decision stage where a paper goes out to review. I know one of the questions last week was in relation to how soon is too soon to contact an editor looking for that first decision. What I do as an author is I set on my Outlook email a 3-month reminder that if I haven't heard from a journal at that point, I might just send a nice courtesy email that says something along the lines of, I recognise that the review process takes time, but I was just wondering when I might hear the first decision. So somewhere around 3 months is that usual process. Then expect that, like the paper that's going forward, would need to undertake revisions. Majority would be major revisions. And again, there's a large window of, say, between 4 to 6 months usually to undertake those, because it's not that you're just doing that paper. You've obviously got lots of other things to do, so there's a large time scale there. You might return it within 1 month, that's fine. But then the process is the same again if it's on major revision, that it will go out to reviewers, the editor will make a decision. So there's a lot of different stages involved, but ultimately journals are and editors are very heavily invested in ensuring that not only are the best papers accepted, but we're really interested in making sure that once those papers are in print, that they have the impact that you as an author are looking for. And that requires us making sure and helping you to get the very best out of your paper.
Thank you, John. Another question is sort of going back to right at the beginning of the writing process is we've all seen these amazing authors who manage to turn out a great number of papers within a very short period of time. And of course, we all wish that we could emulate them. Do you have any tips on making the space for writing and managing the actual writing process that goes in even before you're submitting to a journal?
Okay, so for me, there are two parts to that question. The first one is, yes, there are some people out there who can turn out lots of papers very quickly. Don't be put off by that. Some of it comes with experience, some comes with a particular style of writing. I think it's far more important to think about yourself and just to focus on trying to publish the research that you've got and to try and do the best that you can for your career and promoting your research. So I certainly don't look to churn out lots and lots of papers. What I try to do is to focus very much on quality rather than quantity. So to try and do that, what I do in my own experience is increasingly block out time. So with managing teaching and admin responsibilities and various different tasks, if I see a morning in my diary that doesn't have anything in it, I block it out and I do not open my email. So every time I open my email, I get distracted. So the only way that I can write is to block out 2 or 3 hours to get myself into writing. I always try as a minimum, so as an academic, balancing these different tasks, it's different as a PhD student, but I always try to prioritise and make sure that I have at least a full day, but it might be a morning and an afternoon every week without fail to focus on writing.
Thanks very much, John. That's good advice. Opening email can be very distracting indeed. I think we've still got lots of questions. We're gonna take one more question. I'm sorry if we've not had time to answer your specific question, but we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up. And that question is about the sort of the quality of journals and whether one should target an article at what we might call a highly ranked journal, a high quality journal, although the metrics on measuring this are very problematic in themselves. But should one target a high impact, high quality journal to start with, or should one be looking to target a sort of lower ranked journal, if you like? Do you have any advice?
I would say that there is no right or wrong answer. Because again, if I use my own experience, one of the first papers I submitted was to, at the time, the highest impact factor journal in geography, expecting to get an ESH reject. Also, if I'm honest, and I think one of the good things of these webinars is to try and get behind some of the myths about publishing. So I only submitted this paper to that particular journal because I was applying to get a conference grant to go to a conference. And I thought if I said that the paper that I was going to present at that conference was submitted to a journal in that area, it would increase my chances of getting the funding. I actually had the smoothest route through peer review of any paper that I've ever submitted, and that was going to the highest impact factor journal there was. So there is an element of I always think that if you think you have a really strong paper, it's one of if you've got, say, 5 papers or 3 papers, whichever is your best of those, yes, target it at the highest journal, okay? You often find, particularly again with early career researchers, don't be put off and thinking it's only for established mid-career senior academics. Quite often, and looking back, when you're doing your PhD, that is the opportunity where you have this fantastic opportunity to do a big piece of research, go off in a really interesting new area. The further through your career you get, the more you're encouraged or you get drawn back to writing a small incremental development of a long body of research. So sometimes those don't appeal to the biggest journals or the highest impact journals because it's not necessarily that new compared to what you've already been writing, your kind of CV already. So if you have a paper that you think is really strong and has a really strong significance and is making a major breakthrough, yeah, I would always encourage you to go to those high impact journals. But you do need a mentor to give you honest advice. So I was very lucky because I was given advice by my PhD supervisor to target a particular paper, a high impact journal. But I was also given the same advice in the opposite way, that actually a paper that I thought might be quite good was actually more appropriately targeted at maybe what you consider a mid-ranking journal, because actually it was a far better fit for that journal than it would be to go to a high impact journal where the aims and strokes weren't as aligned.
Thank you very much, John. I'm afraid that is all we have got time for. Thank you to everyone who has joined us today from around the world. Thank you to the Regional Studies Association for organising these events and for their team who is working very hard behind the scenes to make everything run smoothly. And of course, thank you very much to John Harrison from Loughborough for joining us today and for sharing his wisdom as an author and as an editor. A reminder that this is a weekly series of professional development webinars, and the next one will be the same time next week, Engaging with Policy Makers by Lewis Dixon. So please do join us then. Thank you very much to everyone, and goodbye.